Most wars in U.S. history were not needed to protect national security. Domestic economic and political factors have been an important cause of most major U.S. wars. Personal and political costs to politicians usually decide whether most wars happen. Bueno de Mesquita best summed up the general phenomenon. International relations is, simply put, a venue for politicians to gain or lose domestic political advantage. In national security terms, most U.S. wars were risky and may have even been counterproductive. This book will examine the origins of major American wars, looking for lesser-known domestic causes, which were often decisive in provoking or causing war. When most historians look back at the casus belli of American wars, they focus on the threats that led to conflicts. But history does not support this claim. Even early in its history, the continental United States, with its enviable geographic isolation, was so far away from the world's center of conflicts and foreign powers that it was difficult for any major adversary to project any use of effective military power against it. Later, in the mid-20th century, insofar as the United States was the first nation to develop a large arsenal of nuclear weapons, this made it suicidal for any nation to attack or invade it. This intrinsic natural security and later devastating weaponry raises doubts that most U.S. wars have had much by way of national security value or were initiated to protect the U.S. people and mainland from harm. At America's founding, even most European powers with overseas empires or territories and powerful navies posed only a limited threat to Americans, who are protected by two huge oceans, extensive shorelines, and a vast, rugged interior. Over time, because overseas threats became manageable, Americans focused on their manifest destiny to extend the U.S. government's rule to the North American West Coast. This domestic-focused and self-serving doctrine, devised by American elites, entailed displacing the weakened or distracted the European powers, Spain and France, then holding territory in the Western Hemisphere, annihilating the technologically inferior native peoples who succumbed in vast numbers to European-introduced diseases, and taking advantage of two empires, Britain and Russia, being far away from contested North American land. After the closing of the frontier in the American West in 1890, the American government began eyeing lands across the water. This led, during the Spanish-American War in 1898, to its now displacing a weakened Spanish empire in Cuba, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam, while annexing the strategic naval outpost of Hawaii. President Woodrow Wilson wanted to be a player in planning the world's future after World War I, so he exaggerated the threat of Kaiser Wilhelm II's Germany to the United States, leading to the fateful U.S. entry into World War I. These U.S. military actions during the first century and a quarter of the nation's existence had little to do with an existential threat to the country's territory, people, or cultural way of life, and more to do with economics and politics. And such has been a common theme throughout U.S. history. Domestic factors even played a role in why University of Georgia historian Stephen Barry wrote that his generation, coming of age after the Cold War's end, has yet to fight a war that makes sense to a majority of us in our lifetime. The wars we've witnessed aren't even tragic, they just reek of farce and failed policy. To us, Clausewitz seems simply wrong. War is, with rare exceptions, politics not by other, but by less effective means. Going further, one could conclude from a quick read of major American wars that most were optional, fought for lesser reasons than countering a direct strategic threat to the U.S. territory, citizens, or way of life. During the first century of the American nation, most major U.S. wars were fought to pursue commerce or acquire new territory to enhance the domestic economy, first on the North American continent, then in the Caribbean and East Asia. After World War II, major American wars have been fought to maintain U.S. global hegemony, the need for which has not been driven by U.S. security, but by domestic economic dependence on a new post-war permanent peacetime defense industry, military-industrial congressional complex, which supplies an untraditionally large peacetime standing military at the disposal of the president. The domestic causes of war are harder to uncover because politicians and policymakers, even in their memoirs or private papers, are wary to admit that these were a factor in their decisions. But a careful reading of the American past, albeit often between the lines, suggests that government officials and politicians regularly consider the domestic political ramifications of national security policy in their decision-making. Empirical research has shown that in democracies, domestic factors are the most important determinant of presidential foreign policy making. In few other countries have domestic politics influenced external relations as much as in the United States, because American foreign policy is derived from a combined effort of the executive and legislative branches, both of which are subjected to frequent elections by the public. When I give lectures critical of American wars, it is inevitable that a skeptic in the audience will ask, then which wars in American history do you support? Such a question is intended to test the author's patriotism. However, as I point out in this book, defending the U.S. Constitution is also patriotic, a document which was designed to throw up many roadblocks to going to war and should be our guide. Most analyses of American wars are done by experts in foreign policy. They often forget that the function of foreign policy is to first and foremost safeguard a country's territory, citizens, domestic political and economic systems, and cultural way of life. In other words, foreign policy is a means, not an end. Most American wars, often for lesser goals than these vital ones, in fact have harmed the Republic and its institutions at home and thus should not have been undertaken. Even when wars were allegedly commenced to protect America's free political and economic systems and unique individual rights, it should have followed that the least intrusive domestic wartime measures should have been used. Instead, after the United States has entered wars of choice, draconian measures have often been adopted at home that undermined the Constitution and rule of law. Furthermore, it fomented public emotions in support of its political and economic goals, thus, in many cases, fueling the march to war. This book seeks to convincingly demonstrate that domestic factors, most importantly, domestic economic and political factors, have played a hitherto unheralded role in taking the country into wars of questionable strategic necessity, which in turn have had substantial deleterious effects on the Republic's political and economic systems and cultural way of life.